I want to acknowledge this evening that I, at least, am situated on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Oji-Cree, Cree, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And with a land acknowledgement comes a commitment to respect treaty and to move forward in right relationship. And so as I make this acknowledgement, I commit myself to the ongoing work of decolonization within my own life and within the communities I am a part of. Now, we are coming from many places, and if you know the names of the peoples whose territory you live on, I'd invite you to take a moment and enter those into the chat, and that will serve as our larger group land acknowledgement this evening. A bit by way of introduction. My name is Allegra Friesen Epp, and I'm an intern with Mennonite Church Canada's Indigenous-Settler Relations Office. And I also work with the Turtle Island Solidarity Network within Christian Peacemaker teams. This evening, I am thrilled to host a conversation that is near and dear to both of these organizations. CPT reservists and Mennonite Church members Esther Kern and David Janzen will be sharing about their recent experiences accompanying land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory. Here's a little bit about Esther. Esther joined CPT in 2004, and she has served as a CPT reservist in Hebron, Palestine, Colombia, the US-Mexico border, Northern Iraq, and Turtle Island. Esther was an operating room nurse and nurse educator for many years, and she is a member at Valleyview Mennonite Church in London, Ontario. And David joined CPT in 2002. As a CPT reservist, he has worked primarily in Hebron, Palestine, and more recently with CPT's Turtle Island Solidarity Network. Most of David's career was in the travel insurance business, and he and his partner Gloria attend Valleyview Mennonite Church in London, Ontario. I also want to introduce you to Rochelle Friesen, Canada coordinator with CPT, and she's agreed to monitor all things technological this evening. So many thanks to you, Rochelle. And Steve Heinrichs, Director of Indigenous-Settler Relations for MC Canada, will be monitoring the chat this evening. So please feel invited to type your questions into the chat throughout the evening, and Steve will collect those for our Q&A time towards the end. And you can also send Steve your question in a private message if you prefer it didn't go to the whole. Before I turn things over to David and Esther, I wanted to provide a brief background on the current situation in Wet'suwet'en. So many of you will know that Wet'suwet'en is a nation located in what is colonially known as northwestern British Columbia. The nation is 22,000 square kilometers, and all of it remains unceded. So that means that the Wet'suwet'en have never given up title to their lands. And over the last number of decades, many pipelines have been proposed through Wet'suwet'en territory without consent of the hereditary chiefs. And the latest pipeline, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, is no exception. It's a 670-kilometer liquefied natural gas pipeline that is being pushed through Wet'suwet'en territory without the consent of the hereditary chiefs. In 2019 and 2020, police raided Indigenous camps that were set up along the pipeline route, and these raids were backed by the British Columbia Supreme Court. Not only did this violate Wet'suwet'en law, it also violated a ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada back in 1997. And they ruled that the hereditary chiefs hold rights and title over ancestral lands and therefore must be consulted in all resource extraction projects. This fall, Coastal GasLink was preparing to drill under Wet'suwet'en, the sacred headwaters of the Wet'suwet'en people. And so Coyote Camp was established a camp set up on the drill pad to prevent Coastal GasLink from drilling under the river. On November 18th and 19th, the police violently raided Coyote Camp. Over 35 people were arrested, and the camp has since been burned and bulldozed to the ground. Now the Wet'suwet'en are not backing down, and they are making plans to return. And we'll talk more about what that might look like and how we can support them towards the end of the webinar. But first, we want to hear from David and Esther about their time in Wet'suwet'en, and they were there at Coyote Camp just a month before the arrests happened. So thank you, David and Esther, for sharing your time and stories this evening. And I believe David will start us off.
Thank you, Allegra. And it's certainly is a pleasure to be able to share my story with everyone. It's some parts are disturbing, and certainly they have affected me in a serious way. But I want to start with something I ran across, of course, on social media. They've got so much great information, but and that statement was made that prejudice is the emotional commitment to ignorance. And that's a perfect statement to make on this kind of topic, because there is so much misinformation out there, and so many people are prejudiced against Indigenous and certainly others as well. So prejudice is the emotional commitment to ignorance. I'll share my screen now. I'll be showing a few pictures. Okay, can everyone see that okay? All right. I think it's important that we get our facts straight and know the background. A friend of mine, a neighbor, fellow Valleyviewer, lent me his copy of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And, there's a lot of, as I say, misinformation out there. I think, people don't realize that prior to 1960, the Indigenous were not allowed to have legal representation or even go to law school in court. So you can imagine how slanted the treaties were at that time. They weren't allowed to vote until the 1970s. And of course, in that time, the residential schools robbed a lot of the children of their childhood. A lot of people figure that we're giving a lot of the taxes to the Indigenous. They don't realize that there are things like the British North American Act that gave the Indigenous Trust Fund that has over $630 million in that fund, besides annuities and other trust funds that are set up to pay. The government is in charge of doling out this money. As Allegra said, the Wet'suwet'en territory is quite large. It's 22,000 square miles, and includes cities like Smithers and Houston that we visited. And that land was never ceded. And when you read in the paper that, in some papers, that the band chiefs are against the protests and hereditary chiefs are against the pipelines, what people don't realize is that technically the band chiefs are not in charge of anything outside of the reserve, and those reserves do not include the land where the pipelines pass through. So it's the hereditary chiefs who have the jurisdiction. Excuse me. Going back a little bit, this past summer, several members of Christian Peacemaker teams in Mennonite Church Canada, including Steve, had a visit to the Wet'suwet'en territory. And CPT was invited back to participate as legal observers. Now, CPT has had more than 35 years of doing this kind of work all over the world. We only go to places we're invited by groups committed to like-minded, nonviolent solutions. So why legal observers? Well, let me introduce you to the Community Industry Response Group. They are a division of the BC RCMP. They're people volunteer to be in that group. Of course, they're paid more to be in there. But their duty is specifically to break up protests or any infractions against pipelines or industry. Interestingly, they were dispatched on that raid the same day that the flood started in southern BC. They were also used, some of you may have heard of the Fairy Creek old growth forest area, where over 1,000 arrests were made and dozens of people were injured. A week before we arrived, there was an invasion by this group in that area. And there was one fellow in particular who we got to know who was severely injured. He was attached to a bus, and they tried to wrench him out of there, and there was no way of getting him out. And he has some permanent injuries from that. It wasn't physically possible for him to let go. So this is tantamount to torture. So our particular group, we flew into Smithers on the 1st of October. And luckily, this is the only grizzly bear that we met in the Smithers airport, and started to enjoy the fantastic scenery of the coastal mountain range. I loved going out first thing in the morning and watching the sunrise over the silver peaks, the peaks there. A number of us stayed in the main camp at kilometer 44. Smithers is about 45 minutes from Houston, and then from Houston you take a 45-minute drive on what used to be a logging road. The road between Smithers and Houston, by the way, is along the Highway of Tears, notorious for the missing and murdered women, Indigenous women. So the base camp we stayed at for a couple of days, and then 2 of us left to go to Coyote Camp, which is about 20 kilometers further up the road. We had to, of course, isolate because of COVID regulations, at our own separate tents for a while until we tested negative on the 5th day. We could still, of course, participate in outdoor activities. Now, the first week was quite difficult for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the cold, but the biggest issue was the CIRG, the RCMP, raided the camp, visited the camp, if you like, every day. Now, the officers would generally hide their badge numbers and names. They would make crude jokes about genocide, empty the water cisterns. Here you can see where their water, this was a company water cistern that we would just use for washing dishes and stuff. But they emptied it, tried to empty our cistern as well, but we told them to stop. Slashed tires, stole ATV keys, and harassed both ourselves and the media that were there as well. the kind of things as an observer, I would follow them around. And at one point, one of the officers called out, "Hey, Blue, come on, Blue," as if I was following them, as if I was a dog. Another one tried to pose with me as the others were taking pictures of him, and I told him, "Stay away, stay your 6 feet away because of the COVID." So it was obvious their visits were to gather intelligence, see how many people were involved, and to test our abilities. They finally stopped coming when Indigenous allies from the east drove them out, saying that they were trespassing, they weren't welcome, and that the Haudenosaunee people and other Indigenous allies from across the country were supporting the Wet'suwet'en people. So what did we do there? Well, of course, we would document anything we see that especially RCMP would do that we felt was either irregular or questionable. And it's amazing how people's behavior changes when they know they're being watched. There was a lot of work, of course, winterizing the camp. There was wood to chop and pile, install wood stoves in the tents, dig and build outhouses, and build a new kitchen that would stand up to the snow. Besides that, camp life had a lot of chores: dishwashing, hauling water from the river, directing water away from living areas, carrying supplies across barricades. Now the barricades, they're a kind of a double-edged sword. I think I showed one of them here. There's one of them. There's an old beat-up Jeep in there covered by that. They're there to block traffic from coming through, and are very effective in that respect. But it was a double-edged sword, because it meant that we would have to carry things anywhere the ATV couldn't go, which was meant that we had to carry things sometimes 1 or 2 kilometers. And of course, this seemed to always happen at night, in the middle of the night. And especially walking over the tree fall, over branches and everything, it was pretty hazardous. The work was exhausting, and of course, sleep was difficult that time. But you know, the people were strong and committed. I recall one of the Haida women, we had some women visiting from the Haida Nation, splitting a whole pickup full of logs in less than 2 hours. She was amazing. Fortunately, there were also times for walks through the forest. Sorry about that. And I've already shown you some pictures of the mountains. This is a morning shot of the mountains in the distance, and it was just beautiful. There was, of course, a lot of people there. I know that we had conversations with a number of Indigenous people, and we, one of our party, Annika, who showing here, drinking out of the river that we're trying to protect, was speaking to a Indigenous man who was looking in the distance, and we were looking in the distance. We were looking in the mountains, and of course, Annika asked, "Boy, isn't it beautiful?" And he said, "Well, no, it's awful." He was looking at the clear cut, the right of way, that where the pipeline was going to go. And so his view was on what the destruction was happening. There was time for walks, and we had a great time at the Healing Center, which was the scene of another raid last year. Of course, it was our weekly shower and laundry. The hospitality was just wonderful everywhere. Now, the pipeline traffic on this former road was mind-boggling. they could, you could have days with well over 100 vehicles, all manner of vehicles, large heavy-duty trucks to regular pickups and so on. And a lot of us just supply to the man camp, which was further up the road. Now, I don't know if how many this man camp had, but some of them go up to 500 people. And of course, the security people would pass by slowly and generally take photographs of us as well. Now, because this road was pretty rough, we ended up with a hole in our tire in our rental vehicle. So I ended up going to town into Houston to get a tire fixed. Sitting there, starting a conversation with a young man who was all excited about moose season. So I asked him, well, what are the numbers like? What's it going to be like? Oh, not many around. They're talking about a wolf and bear call. Of course, our hosts, the Indigenous people, would say it has a lot more to do with human activity. You imagine over 100 vehicles on this road where we did see bears and so on occasion, but that had a lot more to do with the low moose population. So camp life was tough, but the friendships and camaraderie were great. Everyone was working together with purpose. There was a kaleidoscope of people represented there, Indigenous from Haida Gwaii, Mohawk and Seneca from Ontario, a lot of activists from British Columbia, and included all genders. Made good friends with a trans person. For me, the toughest part was getting pronouns proper. It's hard enough remembering names, but to also know the pronoun was a struggle, but I managed after a while. Annika helped me a lot with that. We all had code names for security reasons because we expected that there were times that we were being listened to. My name was Hiker. And I was really glad to be able to connect with one of the Six Nations people who I won't name, but many of you know him, because I know his uncle in London. And a couple of weeks ago, I met up with him in London and received a huge bear hug. So that was really felt good. The leadership at the camp was well organized, knowledgeable, not only about life in the woods, but also their cultural and spiritual matters. Every day we started with every meal we started with a spirit offering. And we were all given a chance to say a prayer at that time. Sorry, I'm just going to go back. No, too far. And these times were very important, and especially with the leader of the camp, Molly and Shay, who had a drum song, a couple of drum songs every day. And Molly was the camp leader, and she gave up a lot. 2 kids, husband, they live very close by, so we'd see the kids once in a while. But she was out there fully committed to saving their land and the river. Although the leadership were young, they were knowledgeable about the spiritual heritage and glad to share it with everyone. We grew to respect them deeply. So it was with great sadness and grief as we watched videos and saw photographs of what took place a few weeks after we left. As I said, the directive for raiding the camp was given at the same time that the floods were going on. It seemed like very ridiculous time to spend the police forces going up there to do that. They were raided by fully armed police, helicopters, attack dogs, full military gear. And this is to a camp where there's the only weapon might be a hunting knife. They, of course, they were all arrested. For the court, of course, this happened on a Friday, so they could keep them over the weekend. And so when the court cases happened, the Indigenous people were treated with more contempt and shame than the white folks. Even in the court hearings, some of them were in shackles, only dressed in their long johns. And of course, Coyote Camp was bulldozed. All these buildings here that you see are gone. That was the kitchen area that we had built. And even the cabin that was set up for Chief Woo's daughter and son-in-law was burnt to the ground. But no one has given up. There have been many supportive actions across Canada, even in the last week or so. We expect to hear more things going on shortly. You know, in my time with CPT, there's only been a couple of times, a couple of statements made by law enforcement officers that have stuck in my mind. There's, I won't give his actual name, but Sergeant C twice said to me, "Settler life is pretty good, isn't it?" It really struck me. Why did he say settler life is pretty good, isn't it? It was directed at me. I was the only one there. And obviously to sow division in the group and get me to rethink my role there, as if stopping the pipeline would threaten my lifestyle. And maybe it would. Maybe my lifestyle needs to change. The other statement that has stuck with me for many years was actually from an Israeli border policeman in Hebron, who asked where I was from, where I was born. And when I told him Canada, he said, "Well, you're not in Canada anymore. And besides, we learned everything from you." These statements and attitudes reflect colonialism to the fullest. You know that in Canada, Canadian law prior to 1951, the Indigenous people were not considered or treated as humans. As with any other propaganda, one has to dehumanize their opponent. One doesn't have to look far to hear negative comments about the Indigenous. Remember what I said in the beginning, prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. We have a lot of work to do undoing what colonialism has done to our Indigenous people. I will give you some references in the chat when I'm done, but arm yourself with knowledge. I'll also mention the Mennonite Church Canada has issued 7 calls to climate change, and one of those calls is to support the land defenders, our Indigenous population. Thanks, and I'll pass it over to Esther.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your powerful sharing. Esther, are you good to go? See if we can unmute Esther. There we go.
I'm just trying to get up my PowerPoint. Is there a tip that you can give me?
So do you see the screen share button at the bottom of the Zoom screen? It's green.
I have clicked that, and I have my PowerPoint up on the screen.
So when you hit the
there we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
This is great. If you want to go, Esther, to where it says slideshow in the toolbar, up towards the top.
Oh, there.
You should be able to, if you click on that, and you go far to the left, you can hit from the beginning. Awesome. Take it away.
Okay. Well, it has been said that great minds think alike, and that thought just came to my mind right now because maybe David and I have the capacity to think alike on some of these issues, and it feels as though we could just end the session right here with what has already been said, with your introduction, Allegra, and your explanation, David, of all the work that we did there. But I will just do a bit of editing as I go through so that we don't have too much duplication. But just wanted to say that first impressions are lasting impressions. And in arriving at Wet'suwet'en Traditional Territory in Northern British Columbia, I was just overwhelmed with awe at the beauty and the wonder of the area there. And it gave me a deeper perspective and appreciation of the desire to preserve and protect the land and to protect the waters there. And as we went through the our time there, I was always stunned by just the pure beauty of the area. This is the Koala River, and the water was so pure that we were able to use that as our drinking water for the entire time that we were there. And it wasn't only the river, it was the pine forests interspersed with poplar trees laden with golden leaves of autumn. And at night, without any light pollution, the stars that shone like brilliant diamonds against a dark velvet sky. And there were many times that I just stood there in awe, looking at the Milky Way, the Big Dipper, and the full moon casting silver shadows across the landscape. And during our time there, we did see animal life. We saw moose, black bears, deer, ravens, bald eagles, and other small forest creatures. And as David has already mentioned, we did see one grizzly bear. Thankfully, he was behind an acrylic display case at the Smithers Airport, and that for me was close enough. However, immediately I was struck by the fact that the natural beauty of Wet'suwet'en territory is being destroyed by violent colonialism, by greed, by relentless pursuits for profits by investors, and our voracious appetites for fossil fuels. It represents devastation of a pristine land, uprooting of people's way of life, destruction of wildlife habitat, disappearing salmon in the waterways, and the potential for a catastrophic pipeline ruptures in the future. And it has also already been mentioned, but I will mention it again. It's a contribution to climate change, which has been so evident just recently with the rain, mudslides, and flooding in BC. And one only has to turn on the television and see the news about the tornadoes that have ripped through the US and leaving behind a huge path of destruction and death. So it was a great honor and a privilege to be invited to stand in solidarity in nonviolent resistance with the Indigenous community in the Ellington and the Coyote camp. Upon our arrival at Ellington camp, where I spent most of my time, I was also issued the typical orange reflective vest of a legal observer. Uh-oh, what's happening here? And that was with the expectation of serving in that capacity, a role that was familiar to me, which I often assumed when I was in Palestine. And also with my experience as a registered nurse, I was quickly designated as the camp medic, which was a perfect fit for me. And as such, I treated all the injuries in the camp, many wounds. I tested all the volunteers for COVID. And thankfully, all of the COVID tests were negative. And oh, I forgot to turn him around. But anyway, here's one happy client giving a thumbs up because his COVID test was negative. And you may recognize him as one of our speakers for tonight. I also treated other illnesses and responded to emergencies. One of the emergencies that I responded to was a very, very sick woman with a sudden onset of stabbing chest pain, facial droop, slurred speech, and left-sided weakness, which had developed during the night at the Coyote camp. They quickly transported her down to Ellington so that I could assess her symptoms. And this was a true emergency. And using our rental vehicle, I quickly drove her to the nearest hospital emergency room in Smithers, which was a 1.5 hour drive away. And then the most disturbing injury that I treated was Goldie. And David has already referred to Goldie as the young man who was shackled to the underside of a school bus used to barricade the logging road to the drill site near the Coyote camp. And here's a picture of that school bus, which was retrieved after that raid and was used again to blockade the road. Police officers who responded to the blockade on September the 27th used pain compliance as a way of trying to extract him, twisting his body and torturing him both physically and psychologically. On the video documenting this event, one can hear his screams of pain. When pain compliance tactics didn't work, the RCMP called in Coastal GasLink workers to use their mechanical devices to free him. Goldie became one of my regular patients. On an almost daily basis, I monitored the extensive crush injuries in his right arm, the extensive bruising, the level of numbness in his hand, which is an indication of nerve injury, the painful tendons in his hand, and his painful right thigh. He required regular pain administration and management and chemical aids for sleeping. He was very clearly in a PTSD mode, and we often talked about the emotional triggers that he experienced throughout the day whenever anything out of the ordinary took place. His youthfulness, though, served him well. And on my final day at camp, which was 3 weeks after the initial incident, he came to me and triumphantly announced that he had been able to work with a chainsaw for the. We were fortunate not to have any intrusions into our camp, such as the ones that David has already described, but there was one exception. One day they did stop, they got out of their vehicles and they photographed all the license plates of the vehicles that were parked outside of the camp. We also received taunts from passing RCMP vehicles. The Coastal GasLink workers photographed us, and they often shone bright spotlights into our faces. And one particular industrial truck, when he passed by early in the morning, about between 4 and 5 a.m., he would just lay on his horn so that he could be heard all throughout the camp. But the harassment, the intimidation, and the concerns about imminent RCMP raids did not deter us from building community. And that for me was the most significant aspect of the time that we spent there. The heart and center of the community and the main gathering spot was the tent kitchen, where many relationships were formed as we gathered to break bread. There was a strong bond and communal spirit which developed while we were standing in solidarity with the Indigenous community. And we were the recipients of their gracious and warm hospitality. For example, after several nights of sleeping in a tent on the cold, hard ground, we were invited into the warm, cozy cabin of Chief Wass. The community represented a universal mosaic with many Indigenous members from British Columbia, and as David has mentioned, a number of Indigenous groups from Ontario, such as the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee. And as he mentioned too, with the need for security, everyone had alternative names. And with few exceptions, we never learned the true identities of the persons with whom we were living. And there were many languages that were spoken in our little community. Among them were many Indigenous languages: English, Spanish, Arabic, Punjabi, Hebrew, and German. Within this circle of friends, there were many sacred moments. And these were marked by, first of all, drumming and singing and offering tobacco around the spirit fire. Tobacco is one of the sacred medicines. Giving thanks to the Creator with the offering of the spirit bowl before each and every meal. And then there was the mixing, kneading, and baking of challah bread each Friday night after sundown as a ritual for the beginning of Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath. After lighting the traditional candles, Mud led us through the Hebrew narrative of this Jewish ritual. Another bread, which was prepared by our Indigenous cook teddy bear, was Indigenous Fry Bread. It was absolutely delicious, and it drew people from all over the camp to take part in the eating of this bread. About once a week or so, we were visited by 3 or 4 clan chiefs from the area, coming to the camp, checking us out, and thanking us for being there. We had one young woman who celebrated a 25th birthday, and we marked the occasion by collecting what flowers were left in the bush, decorated the tables, baked a carrot cake, and of course, we sang happy birthday. There were many deep conversations of the heart and soul, which took place as we worked together, each offering our own unique skills. There were many warm hugs with comments like, "I am so glad you are here," or "Thank you so much for coming." And there were many random acts of kindness and gifts from the heart. Among them was an invitation from Frida, the director of the Healing Lodge, to use the facilities there. And this is one of the beautiful buildings with a very impressive Indigenous painting along the wall. And that's where we had our much needed showers, did our laundry, and were recipients of very gracious hospitality, courtesy of Allegra. We were greeted with warm muffins, a delicious lunch, and later a tour of this oasis of learning, healing, and tranquility. Along the way, we were reminded of the issues the Indigenous people still struggle with. Who really owns the land? And what about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which was symbolized by red dresses, which we saw in a number of places. And there were red dresses at Ellington camp as well, and we saw them in many other places. And there was always the reminder that water is sacred. To sum up this community experience, as a group, we brought open hearts and open minds, living, working, laughing, eating together, caring for one another, all with a common purpose and becoming community with all the richness and diversity of life, in spite of the outside tensions, which were a constant companion. And I ask you, does this not sound like true kingdom living? Although there has been deafening silence from government leaders on this issue of what is happening in Wet'suwet'en territory, there are organizations and faith communities which are making public statements. 2 in particular I would like to mention. Among them is the British Columbia Mennonite Church Indigenous Relation Task Group, which has issued a statement of opposition to these pipelines which violate the fundamental right of free, prior informed consent and contribute to escalating climate change. They urge a halt to the project and the associated erosion of trust with Indigenous nations. Christian Peacemaker Teams, of which I am a member, has issued its own statement as representative of an ecumenical community committed to the principles of reconciliation set forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I would like to ask, what about our own personal statements? What are we prepared to do? How are we prepared to take action? Is it time for us white privileged settlers to move out of our comfort zones and join hands in a healing journey toward justice and reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters? By joining hands, and in the words of my Mohawk friend, we may just achieve Skanankawa, deep peace. Thank you.
Amen to that. Thank you, Esther. We want to take some time now for questions. And Esther and David have agreed to respond to try and respond to questions that you may have. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve at this point to facilitate that time. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, you're welcome, Allegra and Esther and David. Thank you so much. I think along with the rest of the circle here, our hearts are so grateful for your witness, for your sharing, and for the challenge that you've offered up tonight. I'm just so humbled and moved by what you've shared. We're going to do a choose your own adventure for our questions tonight. We've received a few, and I'm just going to put them towards you, and whatever resonates with your heart, or maybe what unsettles you most, you want to respond to. So you can pick whichever question. So I'll just read these 3 questions, and then David and Esther, you can respond in whatever order you prefer. So the first one is the longer one, and maybe it's the most challenging one. For many in the public, the situation of Wet'suwet'en territory looks really complicated. In the media, you are constantly hearing about division in the Wet'suwet'en community, with band councils and community members actively supporting the pipeline, in contrast to the land defenders and hereditary chiefs. You all decided to go up there to stand with the land defenders. I think there are some of this in this circle who want to take a stand and to take sides in this situation. How did you come to that place? What was your discernment process? So that's one question. The second one is this. You two are Mennonites. How does your commitment to pacifism fit with your support for a blockade? And then the third question. Not many retirees are choosing to do this kind of work in their free time. What inspires you to do what you're doing? So 3 questions. You go where your heart wants to go. Esther, David, I invite. David, we'll start with you because Esther just finished with sharing. So I'll pick on you, brother.
Yeah, there's a lot there. My retirement is all about doing things that I know I want to do now instead of have to do. And a long time ago, I was looking at going back to university. I looked at becoming going to social work, whatever. And but even back in the 70s and 80s, you needed a master's to get any kind of job. So I decided that I'd fulfill my desire to do things by volunteering. So now I have a lot more time to volunteer. The work with CPT, I could stretch out maybe a month to get away. Now I can go longer whenever COVID is over anyway. Yeah, as far as the passivism, I don't like the term passivism. I think if you believe in something, you have to be an activist. And so that's how I choose. So if I believe in justice, then that's something that I should be willing to work for. And it goes right back to the beginnings of CPT, the challenge that if people are willing to die for their country, in the case of war, then we should be willing to risk our lives, stick our necks out a little bit to work for peace. And that challenge has always been a real motivator for me. Not that we need any more martyrs, and that's not what I'm after, but no, it gives me time to do things that I want to do rather than have to do.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Esther?
Well, I might just start with saying that I grew up in an old order Amish family and community. And in many ways, looking back, it was a very closed community, and it was very oppressive, and especially of women and their role in community life and in society. And then I had the rare opportunity to go to Goshen College, and that was my period of transformation, those 4 years. That was during the Vietnam War, and of course there were a lot of activities in regard to advocating for the stopping the war. And so I got involved in a bit of activity, and at that point, and it just opened up a whole new horizon for me. And now at this point in my life, I just simply say I'm making up for lost time. There were so many opportunities that I did not have as as I was growing up. And another motivating factor is that the Old Order Amish community with which I was a member, I was baptized when I was 13, actually split because one half of the church wanted to become more involved in mission outreach, and that was in supporting the building of a residential school in Red Lake, Ontario. And I remember all the work that we did to preserve food to send to Red Lake, and the monies that were directed toward the building of the residential school. And as I learn more about what actually happened, and especially now that I'm a part of CPT, it's my way of making amends for the wrongs, simply turning the wrongs into rights, as you wrote and you edited the book, From Wrongs to Rights. And so this for me is how I put wheels on my faith, and yeah, I'm making up for lost time.
I was just going to address that first question. Divisions among the Wet'suwet'en people. I dare say, I think we Mennonites have some divisions, if I do recall. It's not unique to any one people. But when you look at the history of how the bands were set up, the traditional ways were ignored, and the traditional ways actually supported women at far greater roles. And the fact that the bands, and to be on the reserve, you had to meet requirements. And a lot of people, for example, women who married somebody from off the reserve, a white person, would lose their status. So it's not a great system. And like I said during the talk, that the bands only have jurisdiction over their particular territory, and it's not included in the vast part of where the pipeline is going. So you could really question whether or not they have any jurisdiction over that in the first place.
Thanks, David, for that response. And thank you, Esther, as well for your sharing. Just want to flag that there's a number of questions that are in the chat, really thoughtful ones. And we're not going to be able to respond to each of these, but we might be able to respond to Nelson's question in the action section that Allegra is going to bring us to in just a bit. So I'm going to turn it back to Allegra. And again, I think the whole circle is lifting our hands to you, David and Esther, for what you've offered to us tonight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Those who are able, maybe you want to unmute your mics for a second and we can actually do some applause. How's that? Well, there's a smattering, it's coming. Thank you very much. So hang in with us for a few more minutes because we have some calls to action that we want to invite each of you to. We've been blessed by rich learnings and stories this evening, and I trust that these stories have stirred something in each of you. They have in me. So 2 simple yet important actions we want to invite everyone here to. And we hope that you'll also check out the Yinta Access website for more ways that you can take solidarity, that you can show solidarity and take action. And Steve will share that link in a moment. Action item number 1. Land defenders at Coyote Camp have asked people across Canada to write their elected representatives, asking them to call the RCMP off the territory and instead for the elected government officials to meet with hereditary chiefs. And as Esther mentioned, this is an invitation that Mennonite Church British Columbia's Indigenous Relations Task Group recently responded to. So Henry Krause here is here, and he chairs that group. And I've invited him to share just for a minute or two about the statement that MCBC put out and on why they chose to write it. And if Rochelle is able to pin us both, then I'll screen share the statement while Henry speaks to it. Thanks, Henry.
All right. Thanks, Allegra. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks, David and Esther, for the good words you had. Yeah, I'm part of the Mennonite Church BC Indigenous Relations Task Group. And in August, we heard from a couple of folks who were part of the support group for the resistance against the pipeline, the TMX coming through Burnaby, and folks that were in the trees helping to take care of that. So heard from them and their work that they were doing there. And we'd also heard about some of you as you were up in the Wet'suwet'en territory in June with CPT and further work. So out of that hearing, we wanted to do something in solidarity with you, and so we drafted a letter that you can see it on our website, Mennonite Church BC, in the Indigenous Relations page. Drafted a letter for our both our provincial and our federal government representatives, expressing our concern about a couple of things, about the pipelines that are going through traditional territories, and just the lack of respect for UNDRIP that both of our federal and provincial governments have said yes to, the lack of respect for the territories and the leaders that are there, the move to continue the petroleum products being pulled out of the ground and shipped which conflicts dramatically with our calls that they've had for how we're going to reduce our emissions, and just the concerns, especially over the pipeline, the propane liquid gas pipeline around the fracking and all of the concerns there are around that. So we felt this was one way that we could respond, put it up on our site, shared it with our constituency, and then we're able to also share it through Canadian Mennonite and Canadian Mennonite Facebook page so others could see it as well. And part of our hope is that people can use this letter as well as they go see their members of parliament, whether they're federal or provincial, in our case, provincial folks, but those of you outside of British Columbia, to your federal representative, to say, we don't want this to go on with the things that you're doing. You've made promises that point in the opposite direction than what you're actually doing. So we are able to continue to do that and appreciate being able to share that with the rest of you. So thanks, Allegra.
Thanks, Henry. Appreciate that. And yeah, I've certainly looked to MCBC's statement and some of the other groups I've been a part of that are crafting similar ones. So thank you for taking leadership. So on the Yinta Access website, you will find a letter template that you can use to write your own statement. And I'm screen sharing that now, if you can see. And Steve will put a link to it in the chat. So all you need to do is copy and paste this text into an email. If you have the time, take a minute to personalize the text and describe why this issue matters to you. And then you can address it to Nathan Collin. He's the Minister of State for Lands and Natural Resource Operations. And we invite you to CC your member of parliament as well. They have a role to play in holding the federal government accountable. Now, if you can't remember all of these details, don't worry. We're going to send a follow-up email to all the participants of this webinar that will outline the steps to take to send this letter off. But it's an easy action that the folks in Get 'em Den have created a template for us. So it's time to fire these things off in mass volume and make sure Minister Collin gets the message. I'm going to stop screen sharing a moment. There we go. That was action 1. Action 2. Legal defense funds are needed to support land defenders and supporters who are facing charges after the militarized raids on Get 'em Den territory. So we invite you to consider donating to Get 'em Den's Legal Defense Fund. This is a really tangible way that we can show our support. And Steve has put a link for that in the chat as well. So I hope that starts to answer the question that was posed about what the average Mennonite can do. And if you go to the Yinta Access website, there are other action items there as well. We've just highlighted 2 this evening. So as Esther and David both stated, despite the police violence, despite the recent raids, the fight is not over. The Wet'suwet'en are not backing down. And there are plans to return to the territory. And I want to close with the words of Molly Wickham, also known as Slato. She's the spokesperson for Get 'em Den. And this is what she said just as she was released from jail last month. We know and understand and appreciate everybody and everything that has happened in support of us. We will continue to stand for what we know is right. We will continue to stand for Wet'suwet'en. We will continue to stand for Indigenous law and Wet'suwet'en law on our territories. So this is our invitation, friends, to stand with. May we have the courage and the humility to do so. Thank you, and good night.